The candles had barely been lit when Charlotte Hale placed her last coin on the table and smiled as if she had all the money in the world behind her. She did not. She had exactly £40 to her name, a mountain of unpaid bills waiting for her at home, and one single night to change her fortune before her family lost everything they had left. Across the table sat the man everyone in the room had come to watch. Leandon Ashford, Duke of Ravenscroft, leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of someone who had never once worried about money in his life. He was tall, sharp-featured, and famous for two things: his fortune and his skill at cards. No one at these parties had beaten him twice in one season. Some said no one had ever beaten him twice in one night. Charlotte intended to be the first. The card room at Lord Grantham's townhouse was crowded with guests dressed in silk and jewels, but the moment the Duke sat down across from her, the noise around them seemed to fall away. He studied her for a long moment before he spoke. "I do not believe we have met," he said, "and yet you sit down across from me as though we are old friends." "Perhaps we will be, by the end of the night," Charlotte answered, keeping her voice light. "Or perhaps you will simply remember me as the woman who took your money." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. He gestured for the cards to be dealt, and the game began. What the Duke did not know, what none of them knew, was that Charlotte had spent the last 3 years of her life learning exactly how to win. Not through luck, through study. Her father had once employed a quiet, clever man named Mr. Higgins, a former card player who had fallen on hard times and taught mathematics to keep from starving. Before her father lost his fortune to bad investments and worse health, Mr. Higgins had spent long winter evenings teaching young Charlotte far more than arithmetic. He taught her how to count cards without anyone noticing. He taught her how to read the smallest movements in a person's hands, their eyes, the way their shoulders shifted when they held something valuable. He taught her patience, and he taught her how to hide the fact that she was paying attention at all. She had never used any of it, not until tonight. Her family's estate at Hollowmere was 3 months from being seized by creditors. Her younger brother Edmund had made promises to men who did not forgive debts, and their Aunt Margaret, the only relative willing to help, had already given what little she could spare. There was no more time for polite requests or patient waiting. Charlotte needed money, a great deal of it, and she needed it before the end of the season. So when she heard that the Duke of Ravenscroft would be hosting an informal card evening at Lord Grantham's house, she saw her opportunity and took it without hesitation. The first hand was cautious on both sides. Charlotte played carefully, giving nothing away, watching the Duke as closely as he watched her. He was good. Genuinely good. He read the table well and bluffed only when the odds favored him. But he had one weakness, small and almost invisible unless a person knew exactly what to look for. When his hand was strong, he tapped the edge of the table once with his smallest finger. Just once, and only for a fraction of a second. Charlotte saw it on the third hand. She let him win the fourth hand, deliberately, to keep his confidence high and his guard low. By the sixth hand, she understood the rhythm of his play as clearly as if he had shown her his cards himself. "You play differently than most ladies I have faced across this table," he said, studying her over his cards. "Most either giggle nervously or grow far too serious. You do neither. Should I be flattered or concerned that you have made a study of how ladies play cards? Consider it professional curiosity." His eyes did not leave hers. "Where did you learn to play like this, Miss Hale?" The question caught her off guard for only a moment, but she recovered quickly, giving him a smile that revealed nothing. "My father enjoyed cards. I suppose some of it simply stayed with me." It was not entirely a lie, it was simply not the whole truth. She thought briefly of Mr. Higgins, the quiet man who had once sat with her at their old kitchen table, arranging cards into patterns and asking her to remember every single one before he turned them over. He had told her, more than once, that the greatest skill in any game was not cleverness with numbers, but patience with people. Numbers never lied, he had said, but people revealed themselves constantly, in ways they never noticed. A raised eyebrow, a shift in breathing, a pause before an answer that came half a second too late. Charlotte had thought, at the time, that she was simply passing lonely evenings with an old family friend. She had not understood that he was preparing her for a night exactly like this one. By the eighth hand, she began to press her advantage. She won a modest sum, small enough not to raise alarm, large enough to matter. The Duke's easy smile faltered slightly as the pile of coins in front of her grew. "You are quite good at this," he said, and there was something new in his voice now, something sharper than admiration. "I have had a great deal of practice losing gracefully," she said. "Tonight, I find I would rather practice winning." Around them, a small crowd of guests had gathered to watch, whispering behind their fans. It was not every day that anyone challenged the Duke of Ravenscroft at cards and came out ahead, even by a small amount. Charlotte felt their eyes on her and forced herself to remain calm, to keep her breathing even, to give away nothing beyond the composed expression she had practiced for years. The Duke leaned forward, studying her face as though trying to solve a puzzle. "You are hiding something, Miss Hale." Her heart quickened, but her expression did not change. "Everyone at a card table is hiding something, Your Grace. That is rather the entire point of the game." He laughed then, a short, genuine laugh that surprised her. "Fair enough. Shall we continue?" Between hands, a young woman named Louisa Bennet, a friend of Charlotte's from earlier seasons, leaned close and whispered behind her fan. "Everyone is watching you, Charlotte. Do you know what they are saying? They are saying you might be the first person in 3 years to leave this house with the Duke's money instead of the other way around." "Let them say what they like," Charlotte answered quietly, keeping her eyes on the table. "Talk does not put food on anyone's table." Louisa studied her for a moment longer, concern flickering across her face. "You seem different tonight, sharper somehow. Is everything at Hollowmere well?" Charlotte forced a reassuring smile. "Everything is exactly as it should be." It was, of course, another small lie among many, but there was no time to explain the truth. Not here, not with the Duke watching every movement at the table with careful, curious eyes. Louisa returned to her seat, and the game continued. They played 3 more hands. Charlotte won 2 of them, losing the third deliberately to keep him guessing. By the time the evening's game came to its natural end, she had won a total of £200 from him, a sum that would ease her family's most pressing debts for at least a month. It was not nearly enough, but it was a beginning. As the other guests began to drift away toward the refreshment tables, the Duke remained seated, watching her count her winnings with careful, steady hands. "I find myself curious, Miss Hale," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "Will you give me the chance to win my money back?" Charlotte met his gaze directly, allowing herself the smallest, most careful smile. "That depends entirely on how much you are willing to lose, Your Grace. More than you might expect." "Then perhaps we should play again soon." "Tomorrow evening," he said, without hesitation. "My townhouse. A private game, just the 2 of us, and perhaps a few trusted witnesses to keep everything respectable." It was exactly what she needed. A private game meant higher stakes, and higher stakes meant real money. Enough to save Hollowmere before the creditors arrived. And yet something about the intensity in his eyes made her hesitate, just for a moment. He was not a foolish man. He would not continue losing to her without eventually asking questions she could not easily answer. But there was no room left for hesitation. Not with Edmund's debts growing larger by the week, and not with her family's home hanging by a single thread. "I accept," she said. The Duke smiled, and for the briefest moment, Charlotte saw something behind his confident expression that unsettled her far more than his cleverness at cards ever could. It was interest. Real, personal interest. Entirely separate from the game itself. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself that whatever he felt, whatever he believed was happening between them, was simply another card to be played, another advantage to be used carefully and without sentiment. As she gathered her winnings and prepared to leave, Charlotte allowed herself one final glance at the Duke of Ravenscroft. He was still watching her, an unreadable expression on his face, as though he had already sensed that the game between them was only just beginning, and that it was far more complicated than either of them yet understood. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp against her skin as she climbed into the carriage that would take her home. She pressed her winnings against her chest, feeling the weight of the coins, the weight of her family's future resting entirely on her ability to keep playing a game far more dangerous than cards. She thought of Edmund's desperate face when he had confessed his debts to her. She thought of her aunt's tired eyes, and the letters from creditors piling on the study desk at Hollowmere. She thought of everything she stood to lose if her plan failed. Tomorrow evening, she would sit across from the Duke of Ravenscroft again, and this time, the stakes would be far higher. Charlotte closed her eyes as the carriage rolled forward into the darkness and made herself a quiet promise. She would win. Whatever it cost her, whatever risks she had to take, she would win. She had no idea, not yet, just how much winning would eventually cost her. Behind her, at Lord Grantham's townhouse, the Duke of Ravenscroft remained at the empty card table long after the other guests had gone, turning a single coin over and over between his fingers. He had lost money before, plenty of times, to men far more experienced than the quiet, composed young woman who had just left his company. Losing had never troubled him. What troubled him now was something else entirely, A small, nagging certainty that Charlotte Hale had not simply been lucky tonight, and that whatever game she was truly playing, he had only just begun to understand its rules. The letter arrived at Hollowmere before breakfast, and Charlotte knew from the seal alone that it meant trouble. Her brother Edmund read it standing in the doorway of the dining room, his face draining of color with every line. "They want the rest by the end of the month," he said, his voice cracking. "All of it, Charlotte. Not in installments. All at once." Charlotte set down her teacup carefully, forcing her hands to remain steady. "How much is left?" £600. The number hit her like a physical blow. £200 from the Duke had felt like a victory only hours earlier. Now it seemed laughably small against the debt hanging over her family's heads. Their Aunt Margaret, seated at the far end of the table, closed her eyes and said nothing, though her silence spoke clearly enough. There was no more help coming from that direction. "I will handle it," Charlotte said. Edmund looked at her, confused and desperate. "How? We have already sold what little we could spare. There is nothing left to sell." She did not tell him about the Duke, about the card table, about the plan forming quickly and dangerously in her mind. He would only worry, or worse, insist on helping in ways that would only make everything more complicated. Instead, she simply repeated herself, calm and certain. "I will handle it. Trust me, Edmund. Please." Before she left for the evening, Charlotte stopped in the small study that had once belonged to her father, now filled with unopened bills and dust. She opened the bottom drawer of the old writing desk and found the worn deck of cards Mr. Higgins had given her years before, their edges soft from countless hours of practice. She held them for a moment, remembering his patient voice, his steady instructions, the long winter evenings when winning had seemed like nothing more than an interesting game between friends. It felt strange, holding those same cards now, knowing how much depended on the skills they represented. Her Aunt Margaret found her there, watching quietly from the doorway. "You are going to see the Duke again." It was not a question. Charlotte slipped the cards back into the drawer and closed it firmly. "I am." "Be careful, Charlotte. Men like the Duke of Ravenscroft are not accustomed to losing. Pride can turn quickly into something far less pleasant." "I know what I am doing, Aunt Margaret." Her aunt studied her for a long moment, worry etched clearly across her aging features, before finally nodding and stepping aside to let her pass. "Just remember that some games cost more than money, my dear. Guard your heart as carefully as you guard your winnings." The words followed Charlotte all the way to the Duke's townhouse, settling uncomfortably in her chest as the carriage rolled through the darkened streets of the city. That evening, dressed in her finest gown, the same deep blue silk her mother had once worn before her passing, Charlotte arrived at the Duke of Ravenscroft's townhouse for their private game. The house was grand, far grander than Lord Grantham's, with high ceilings and portraits of stern ancestors watching from every wall. A footman led her into a private drawing room where a small card table had already been prepared, along with 2 trusted witnesses the Duke had promised. One was an older gentleman introduced as Lord Whitfield, a quiet man who barely looked up from his newspaper. The other, to Charlotte's mild surprise, was Louisa Bennet. "I asked her to attend," the Duke explained, noticing Charlotte's reaction. "I thought you might feel more comfortable with a familiar face present." It was a small kindness, one Charlotte had not expected, and it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She thanked him and took her seat across the table. "Shall we begin?" he asked. "I thought you would never ask." The stakes tonight were significantly higher than the previous evening, exactly as Charlotte needed. The Duke placed a substantial sum on the table at the start, and Charlotte matched it with the winnings from the night before, along with a small additional amount she had borrowed quietly from Louisa, promising to repay her twice over by morning. The cards were dealt, and the game began in earnest. Charlotte played more cautiously than before, aware that the Duke had likely spent the day thinking carefully about their previous match. She watched for his tell, the small tap of his finger against the table edge, and found it almost immediately on the second hand. He had not changed his habits at all, though she suspected he had changed everything else about his approach to the game. "You seem thoughtful tonight, Miss Hale," he said, studying her over his cards. "Something on your mind?" "Only the cards, Your Grace. Somehow, I find that difficult to believe." She said nothing, keeping her attention fixed on the game, though his words lingered uncomfortably. He was perceptive, far more perceptive than she had given him credit for during their first match, and she reminded herself sharply to be careful, to give away nothing beyond what the game itself required. They played for nearly an hour, trading small victories back and forth, each testing the other's patience and skill. Lord Whitfield eventually lost interest and returned to his newspaper entirely, but Louisa watched closely, her expression shifting between admiration and concern as the stakes continued to climb. During a brief pause between hands, while fresh drinks were brought in, the Duke leaned back in his chair and studied Charlotte with open curiosity. "May I ask you something personal, Miss Hale?" "You may ask. I cannot promise an answer." He smiled at that, though something more serious lingered behind his expression. "Your family's estate, Hollowmere. I understand it has faced difficulties in recent years." Charlotte's stomach tightened, though her face remained carefully composed. "Estates rise and fall, Your Grace. Ours is no different from many others. I did not mean to cause offense." "You have not," she said, softening her tone deliberately. "Simply reminded me of matters I would rather not dwell on this evening." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before nodding and allowing the conversation to move elsewhere. Charlotte breathed a quiet sigh of relief, grateful for the reprieve, though she understood clearly that the reprieve would not last forever. A man like Ravenscroft, sharp-minded and endlessly curious, would not simply forget his questions. He would only wait for a better moment to ask them again. A servant entered briefly to add wood to the fire, and in the small pause that followed, the Duke's steward, a lean, watchful man named Mr. Barlow, stepped quietly into the room and murmured something into his employer's ear. The Duke's expression did not change, but his eyes flicked toward Charlotte for the briefest instant before returning to his cards. She noticed it, filed it away carefully, and said nothing. "Trouble, Your Grace?" she asked lightly, once Barlow had withdrawn. "Nothing of consequence," he said, "merely a matter of household business." She did not believe him entirely, but she let the matter rest, unwilling to press further and risk drawing attention toward questions she could not comfortably answer herself. The game resumed, and Charlotte pushed her worries aside, focusing entirely on the cards in front of her. She won the next two hands decisively, drawing a low, appreciative laugh from the Duke despite his mounting losses. "You are ruthless tonight," he said, though there was no anger in his voice, only genuine admiration. "I prefer the word determined. Determined to win my entire fortune from me, perhaps." "Only a small portion of it," she said lightly. "I would hate to leave you with nothing at all." He laughed again, louder this time, and something in his laughter, warm and unguarded, caught her off balance more than she wanted to admit. She reminded herself firmly why she was here, what was truly at stake, and forced her focus back to the cards. By the final hand of the evening, Charlotte had won a total of £450, more than enough, combined with her previous winnings, to satisfy Edmund's most urgent debt. Relief flooded through her, though she was careful not to let it show too openly at the table. The Duke studied his empty hands after the final round, shaking his head slowly, though his expression remained thoughtful rather than upset. "I find myself in an unusual position, Miss Hale. I have lost a considerable sum to you twice now, and yet I find myself eager for a third match rather than discouraged from further play. Perhaps you enjoy losing more than most gentlemen." "Perhaps," he said, his eyes lingering on hers. "I simply enjoy your company more than I expected to." The words hung in the air between them, unexpected and entirely too honest. Charlotte felt her carefully maintained composure waver, just slightly, before she recovered herself and offered a light, practiced smile. "You flatter me, Your Grace. I rarely flatter anyone. Ask my sister. She will confirm I am dreadfully blunt." Louisa, still watching from her seat nearby, caught Charlotte's eye and raised her eyebrows meaningfully, though she said nothing aloud. Charlotte ignored the silent question entirely, focusing instead on gathering her winnings with steady, careful hands. As the evening drew to a close and the small gathering began to disperse, the Duke walked Charlotte personally to her waiting carriage, an unusual courtesy that did not go unnoticed by the remaining servants watching from the doorway. "I hope you will agree to play again," he said, standing beside the carriage door. "Soon. That depends on how much more you are willing to lose. With you, Miss Hale, I am beginning to suspect the losses might be worth it." She held his gaze for a long moment, uncertain how to answer such an honest statement, before finally offering a small nod. "Send word when you are ready, Your Grace. I will not keep you waiting long." He helped her into the carriage himself, his hand warm and steady against hers, and Charlotte felt an unfamiliar flutter of something she refused to name as the carriage door closed between them. The ride home passed in a blur of relief and quiet unease. Relief, because Edmund's debt would soon be settled, sparing her family from immediate ruin. Unease, because she had not expected the Duke of Ravenscroft to be quite so perceptive, quite so genuinely warm beneath his confident exterior, and quite so difficult to keep at arm's length. When she arrived home, Edmund met her in the entrance hall, his face anxious and hopeful all at once. Without a word, Charlotte placed the full sum of winnings into his hands, watching relief break across his features like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "How did you manage this?" he asked, stunned. "Cards," she said simply. "Nothing more complicated than that." Edmund studied her carefully, sensing there was far more to the story than she was willing to share, but he did not press further, too grateful for the immediate relief to question the details too closely. Charlotte excused herself and climbed the stairs to her room, exhausted from the evening's tension. Alone at last, she sat by her window, staring out at the darkened grounds of Hollowmere, and allowed herself, for the first time that night, to think clearly about the Duke's words. He enjoyed her company. He wanted to see her again, not merely across a card table, but simply for the pleasure of her presence. It should have felt like victory, another advantage to be carefully managed and used. Instead, it felt like something far more complicated, something that unsettled the careful plans she had built so precisely around saving her family's fortune. Charlotte closed her eyes, reminding herself firmly that whatever the Duke felt, whatever she herself might be beginning to feel in return, none of it could be allowed to interfere with what truly mattered. Hollowmere needed saving. Edmund's future needed securing. There would be time enough later to untangle whatever complicated feelings had begun stirring between herself and the Duke of Ravenscroft. Downstairs, unseen by Charlotte, Edmund sat by the fire counting the money she had given him again and again, as though the coins might multiply simply from his attention. Relief had not fully settled into him yet. Somewhere beneath his gratitude was a small, nagging worry about how his sister had truly come by such a sum, twice now, from a man as sharp and observant as the Duke of Ravenscroft. He told himself it did not matter, that whatever Charlotte had done, she had done it for the family, and that was enough. He pushed the worry aside and carried the money to the study, locking it carefully in the old desk drawer beside their father's unopened letters. Upstairs, Charlotte remained by her window long after the house had gone quiet, watching the moonlight settle over the neglected gardens of Hollowmere. She thought of her aunt's warning, of the steward's whispered words she had not quite caught, of the Duke's steady, searching gaze across the card table. Every piece of the evening replayed itself in her mind, and beneath the relief of Edmund's debt being settled, a quiet unease continued to grow. She had expected the Duke to be prideful, perhaps even a little foolish in his confidence, an easy mark for someone with her particular skills. Instead, she had found a man who watched carefully, asked careful questions, and seemed genuinely, unexpectedly drawn to her beyond the cards themselves. It complicated everything. A foolish man would have been easy to deceive indefinitely. A clever, attentive man who was also beginning to care for her was an entirely different and far more dangerous proposition. Charlotte pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window, steadying her breathing, reminding herself once again of everything at stake. Hollowmere, Edmund's future, her aunt's quiet dignity, preserved only by the money Charlotte continued to win. None of it could be risked for the sake of a passing flutter of feeling, however genuine it seemed. And yet, as she finally climbed into bed and closed her eyes, it was not the money she thought of first, but the warmth in the Duke's laughter, and the steady, searching way he had looked at her before she stepped into her carriage. She fell asleep still turning his words over in her mind, uncertain whether she felt more afraid of losing at his card table, or of losing something else entirely that she had not expected to risk at all. For now, there was only the game, and the game was far from finished. Mr. Barlow placed the folded letter on the Duke's desk without a word, his expression carefully neutral in the way only a long-time servant could manage. Julian Ashford picked it up, read the first line, and felt something cold settle in his chest. The letter was short, written in a hand he did not recognize, and it contained a single sentence that would not leave his mind for the rest of the day. A man named Higgins once taught card sharps for a living. Ask Miss Hale about her old tutor. Julian read the sentence 3 times before setting the letter down and staring out the window of his study, watching the gray morning light settle over the gardens below. He had commissioned Barlow to make quiet inquiries after their second card game, unwilling to let his growing suspicions go unexamined any longer. He had expected, perhaps, to learn that Miss Hale had a talent for numbers, or a sharp memory, or simply excellent instincts at the table. He had not expected this. "Who sent this?" Julian asked without turning around. "Anonymous, Your Grace. Delivered by a street messenger this morning. I have made further inquiries since receiving it, and I believe there is some truth to the claim." Julian turned to face him. "Tell me." Barlow cleared his throat, choosing his words with obvious care. "A man named Higgins was employed briefly by Miss Hale's father some years ago. officially as a tutor in mathematics. Before that position, records suggest he spent time in less respectable circles, teaching card techniques to gentlemen willing to pay handsomely for an edge at the tables. There are no formal charges against him, nothing that would stand as proof in any court, but the rumors persist among certain circles that still remember him. Julian sat down slowly, absorbing the information. It fit, uncomfortably well, with everything he had observed across the card table over their 2 games together. The steadiness of her hands, the careful, controlled expression that revealed nothing even when the stakes climbed higher, the way she seemed to anticipate his plays before he fully committed to them. "Does she know how to count cards?" he asked quietly. "It would explain a great deal, Your Grace." Julian pressed his fingers against his temples, torn between anger and something far more complicated. He had lost money before, considerable sums on occasion, and it had never troubled him deeply. Losing to genuine skill was simply part of the game. But losing because he had been deliberately, carefully deceived was an entirely different matter, one that struck at something more personal than his pride. And yet, beneath the anger, another feeling lingered stubbornly, one he was reluctant to examine too closely. He thought of her laughter, unguarded and genuine despite everything else, and the way she had looked at him across the carriage door 2 nights before. Whatever game she was playing, some part of it, he was almost certain, had not been entirely calculated. "Say nothing of this to anyone," Julian told Barlow. "I will handle the matter myself." "Of course, Your Grace." That evening, Julian attended a ball hosted by Lady Pemberton, uncertain whether Charlotte would even be present, though something told him she likely would. Society had begun buzzing about their 2 card games together, and few hostesses would resist the opportunity to have both the Duke of Ravenscroft and the mysterious Miss Hale under the same roof. He found her near the refreshment table, engaged in polite conversation with 2 older ladies who seemed thoroughly charmed by her easy manner. She noticed him approaching and excused herself gracefully, meeting him halfway across the crowded room. "Your Grace," she said, offering a small curtsy, "I did not expect to see you here tonight. Nor I you, though I confess I had hoped I might." Her smile remained steady, though something flickered behind her eyes, a brief flash of caution quickly hidden away. "Have you recovered from our last game? I would hate to think I have damaged your reputation among the other gentlemen." "My reputation survives," he said. "Though I find myself curious about something else entirely." "And what would that be?" He studied her closely, watching for any sign of the tell he had come to recognize so well across the card table, though he understood now that whatever advantage she held over him at cards, it likely extended into everyday conversation as well. "Tell me about your childhood, Miss Hale. Your education specifically. I understand your father valued learning a great deal." Something shifted subtly in her expression, a tightening around her eyes that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "My father believed strongly in education, yes. He hired tutors when finances allowed, much like any gentleman concerned with his children's future." "Any particular tutors that stand out in your memory?" The question hung between them, deceptively casual, though Julian watched her carefully enough to see the exact moment she understood he was probing for something specific. Her composure did not break. Not entirely, but a new wariness entered her expression, subtle enough that anyone else might have missed it entirely. "Several," she said carefully. "Why do you ask, Your Grace?" "Simple curiosity," he said, matching her careful tone. "I find myself wondering how a lady comes to play cards with such remarkable skill. Perhaps I am simply naturally gifted." "Perhaps," he said, though his tone suggested he did not entirely believe it. An awkward silence settled between them, filled with unspoken accusations. Neither was quite ready to voice openly. Charlotte recovered first, offering a bright, deliberately casual smile. "If you will excuse me, Your Grace, I believe Lady Pemberton is signaling for the next dance to begin." She turned to leave, but Julian caught her hand gently before she could step away, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear. "Miss Hale, whatever it is you are hiding, I intend to discover the truth eventually. I would prefer to hear it directly from you, rather than through rumors and anonymous letters." Her eyes widened slightly at the mention of an anonymous letter, though she quickly masked her surprise. "I am not certain what you mean, Your Grace." "I believe you understand precisely what I mean." For a long, tense moment, they simply looked at each other, the noise of the ball fading into the background. Charlotte's mind raced, weighing her options carefully. She could deny everything outright, risk him discovering the full truth on his own, or she could offer him a partial truth, enough to satisfy his curiosity, without revealing everything that remained at stake. "My father did employ a man named Mr. Higgins," she said finally, keeping her voice steady. "He taught me a great deal about numbers, patterns, and memory. Whatever skill I possess at cards, I owe largely to his patient instruction. There is no scandal in that, Your Grace, simply an unconventional education." It was, once again, only part of the truth, carefully shaped to sound complete, without revealing the deeper deception underlying her recent victories. Julian studied her closely, searching for any further sign of dishonesty, though her explanation, however incomplete, was plausible enough to leave room for doubt. "I see," he said finally, releasing her hand. "Thank you for your honesty, Miss Hale." "Of course, Your Grace." She excused herself quickly afterward, disappearing into the crowd of dancers before he could ask anything further. Julian remained where he stood, turning the conversation over carefully in his mind, uncertain whether he had learned the full truth or simply another carefully constructed half-answer. Across the ballroom, Charlotte found Louisa near the edge of the dance floor and pulled her gently aside, her composure finally beginning to crack beneath the surface. "He knows something, Louisa, or at least suspects." Louisa's eyes widened with concern. "What did you tell him?" "Enough to satisfy him for now, but not the whole truth. I do not know how much longer I can keep this from unraveling. Charlotte, perhaps it is time to simply tell him everything. If he genuinely cares for you, as it certainly appears he does, perhaps he would understand your reasons." Charlotte shook her head firmly. "You do not understand, Louisa. Even if he understood my reasons for the deception itself, there is no forgiving a lady who has spent 2 evenings deliberately, methodically taking his money through skills he knew nothing about. Men like the Duke value honesty above almost everything else. If he discovers the full extent of what I have done, whatever warmth currently exists between us will disappear entirely, replaced by nothing but anger and wounded pride. Then what will you do?" Charlotte glanced across the room, finding Julian still standing near the refreshment table, his expression thoughtful and distant as he watched the dancers without truly seeing them. "I do not know yet, but Edmund's debts are not fully settled, not entirely, and Hollowmere still needs saving. I cannot afford to stop now, not when we have come this far. And if continuing costs you his trust entirely?" The question lingered painfully between them, unanswered, as the orchestra began a new song, and couples swept gracefully across the dance floor. Charlotte watched them for a long moment, feeling the weight of her aunt's earlier warning settle heavily in her chest. Some games cost more than money. Guard your heart as carefully as you guard your winnings. She had not guarded it carefully enough. Somewhere between the first card game and this tense, uncertain conversation, she had allowed herself to feel something for Julian Ashford that complicated everything far beyond simple financial necessity. It should have made her more cautious. Instead, it made continuing her deception feel unbearably heavier with every passing day. Later that evening, as her carriage pulled away from Lady Pemberton's townhouse, Charlotte glanced back one final time and saw Julian standing near the entrance, watching her departure with an expression she could not quite read from such a distance, concern perhaps, or suspicion, or something more complicated than either. She settled back against the carriage seat and closed her eyes, exhaustion finally catching up with the tension of the evening. Whatever happened next, she understood clearly that the careful balance she had maintained between deception and growing affection could not last indefinitely. Sooner or later, something would have to give. She only hoped, when that moment finally arrived, that she would not lose everything she had fought so desperately to protect. Back inside his townhouse, Julian sat alone in his study long after the ball had ended, staring at the anonymous letter still resting on his desk. He thought of Charlotte's careful explanation, plausible yet incomplete, and of the brief flash of fear he had seen in her eyes when he mentioned the letter directly. Whatever she was hiding, it was clearly more significant than a simple unconventional education. He picked up his pen, intending to write instructions to Barlow for further inquiries, then paused, setting the pen down again. Part of him, the part increasingly drawn to Charlotte despite everything, wanted simply to ask her directly, to give her the chance to explain herself fully, before drawing his own conclusions. But pride, old and stubborn, held him back from taking that step just yet. If Charlotte Hale had truly been playing him from the very beginning, manipulating both his money and his growing affection with equal, calculated skill, he needed to understand the full truth before allowing himself to fall any further under her careful, practiced charm. He resolved, finally, to request one final card game, higher stakes than either of their previous matches, close enough attention paid that he might finally uncover, once and for all, exactly how much of Charlotte Hale's skill was genuine talent, and how much was deliberate, practiced deception. The next morning a note arrived at Hollowmere bearing the Duke's seal, Charlotte broke it open at the breakfast table, her hands steadier than her racing thoughts. The message was brief and formal, requesting her presence at another private game 2 evenings hence, the stakes to be considerably higher than before. There was no mention of the ball, no reference to their tense conversation near the refreshment table, nothing to suggest whether he had believed her explanation or simply chosen, for now, to set his suspicions aside. Edmund, seated across from her, noticed the fine paper and the elegant seal immediately. Another invitation from the Duke. Yes, Charlotte said, folding the note carefully. Charlotte, I have been meaning to ask you something, and I would appreciate an honest answer. Edmund set down his fork, his expression unusually serious for a young man, normally more concerned with his own troubles than hers. How exactly have you been winning so consistently against a man famous throughout London for his skill at cards? Charlotte's chest tightened, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. I have always had a talent for cards, Edmund. You know this. A talent, yes, but this seems like something more than talent. 2 victories against the Duke of Ravenscroft, significant sums both times. People are beginning to talk, Charlotte, and not simply about your beauty or your charm. They are questioning how you manage it. She set down her own teacup carefully, choosing her words with great caution. Does it matter how, Edmund, so long as the money keeps our family from ruin? It matters if it puts you at risk, he said, leaning forward earnestly. The Duke is not a foolish man. If he begins to suspect you of deceiving him deliberately, the consequences could be severe. Reputation, standing in society, perhaps even legal trouble if he chooses to pursue the matter formally. Charlotte had not considered the full weight of legal consequences before, though the possibility settled uncomfortably in her stomach now that Edmund had voiced it aloud. She had focused entirely on the immediate need for money, on saving Hollowmere and settling their family's debts, without fully considering what might happen if her methods were ever exposed publicly. I will be careful, she said finally, though the promise felt hollow even to her own ears. Please be more than careful, Charlotte. I do not wish to see you hurt, not after everything you have already sacrificed for this family. The concern in his voice touched her more deeply than she expected, and for a moment, she considered telling him everything, the full truth about Mr. Higgins, about her carefully developed skills, about the growing tangle of deception and genuine affection now complicating her relationship with the Duke. But she held back, unwilling to burden him further with worries he could do nothing to solve. I promise you, she said instead, that whatever happens, I am doing this for our family's future, and I will not let it destroy us. Edmund studied her for a long moment before finally nodding, though his expression remained troubled as he returned to his breakfast. Charlotte excused herself shortly afterward, retreating to her room to prepare mentally for the challenging evening ahead. Alone, she took out the worn deck of cards once more, shuffling them slowly between her fingers as she considered her options. The Duke's higher stakes suggested he intended this next game as some kind of test, perhaps even a trap designed to force her hand and reveal the truth he already suspected. She would need to play more carefully than ever before, balancing her genuine skill against the growing risk of exposure. She also could not ignore the deeper complication tangled within all of it. Whatever calculated plan she had begun with, somewhere between the first card game and their tense conversation at Lady Pemberton's ball, her feelings toward Julian Ashford had grown into something far more complicated than simple financial necessity. His warmth, his unexpected humor, the genuine interest he seemed to hold in her beyond the cards themselves, all of it had settled into her heart in ways she had not anticipated and could not easily undo. It would have been far simpler, she thought bitterly, if he had remained merely a wealthy target, an easy mark for her carefully honed skills. Instead, he had become someone whose good opinion she genuinely valued, someone whose eventual discovery of her deception threatened not just her family's reputation, but her own increasingly fragile heart. She spent the following 2 days in restless preparation, reviewing every strategy Mr. Higgins had ever taught her, practicing her composure in front of her mirror until she felt confident she could maintain it even under the Duke's sharpest scrutiny. She also spent considerable time simply worrying, turning over every possible outcome of the coming evening, searching for some way to protect both her family's fortune and whatever fragile connection remained between herself and Julian. By the time the evening of the game finally arrived, Charlotte felt more prepared than she had for either of their previous matches, though a persistent unease lingered beneath her careful composure. She dressed once more in her mother's blue silk gown, drew a steadying breath, and set out for the Duke's townhouse, uncertain whether she was walking toward another victory or toward the beginning of her carefully constructed world finally collapsing around her. Whatever the answer, he intended to find it soon. The third card game began differently than the first two. There was no easy banter, no warm laughter across the table. Julian greeted Charlotte with polite formality, gestured her toward her seat, and signaled for the cards to be dealt almost immediately, his expression carefully guarded in a way that unsettled her more than open suspicion would have. Only Mr. Barlow remained in the room this time, standing quietly near the far wall, watching everything with sharp, attentive eyes. There was no Louisa tonight, no Lord Whitfield buried in his newspaper. Just the two of them, the cards, and a tension that had not existed during their previous matches. "You seem quiet tonight, Your Grace," Charlotte said, attempting to ease the strained atmosphere. "I find myself observing more carefully than speaking," he replied, his eyes fixed on his cards rather than her face. The stakes tonight were substantial, nearly double what they had wagered during their second match. Charlotte understood clearly what this meant. Whatever suspicions Julian harbored, he intended to test them thoroughly tonight, watching her every move with far greater scrutiny than before. She would need to be more careful than ever, though something in her had grown weary of the constant vigilance required to maintain her careful deception. They played the first several hands in near silence, the usual playful conversation entirely absent. Charlotte won 2 hands, lost one deliberately, and felt Julian's eyes studying her far more intently than the cards themselves seemed to warrant. "Tell me something, Miss Hale," he said finally, breaking the tense silence. "When you play, what exactly are you watching? My cards or my face?" The question was pointed enough that Charlotte's composure wavered slightly before she recovered. "Both, I imagine, as any careful player would." "And what do you see when you watch my face?" She met his gaze directly, choosing her words with great care. "Confidence, mostly. Sometimes frustration, when the cards do not favor you. Nothing more specific." The pointed nature of his question made clear he suspected far more than simple observation, and Charlotte felt her pulse quicken uncomfortably. "I am not certain what you are asking, Your Grace." "I think you understand precisely what I am asking." The tension between them stretched taut, neither willing to break first, until Julian finally sighed and set down his cards entirely, rubbing his temples with obvious frustration. "Forgive me, Miss Hale. I did not intend for tonight to feel like an interrogation. I simply find myself unable to stop thinking about certain questions regarding your skill at this game." Charlotte's guarded expression softened slightly at his obvious discomfort. "Perhaps we might set the cards aside for a moment and speak plainly instead. Perhaps we should." He studied her for a long moment before speaking again, his voice quieter now, more personal than accusatory. "I received an anonymous letter recently, suggesting your old tutor once taught card techniques for profit, techniques that might explain your remarkable success against me. I have not been able to stop wondering whether everything between us, every warm conversation, every moment I believed we shared something genuine, has simply been part of an elaborate strategy to win my money." The directness of his admission caught Charlotte entirely off guard, stripping away her carefully maintained composure more effectively than any clever trap could have managed. For a long moment she said nothing, searching desperately for some careful, partial truth that might satisfy him without revealing everything she still needed to protect. But looking at his face, honestly troubled rather than simply angry, she found she could not bring herself to offer another half-truth. "Your Grace, Before she could finish, the drawing-room door opened suddenly, and a young footman entered hurriedly, whispering something urgent to Barlow. The steward's expression shifted immediately from calm attentiveness to visible concern, and he crossed the room quickly to speak quietly with Julian. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but there is a matter requiring your immediate attention. A message has arrived regarding your sister." Julian's expression darkened with sudden worry. "What has happened?" "She has taken ill quite suddenly, Your Grace. The physician has been called, but the household requests your presence immediately." Whatever conversation had been building so carefully between Charlotte and Julian dissolved instantly beneath this new, urgent crisis. Julian rose immediately from the table, his earlier suspicions momentarily forgotten beneath genuine familial concern. "I must go to her," he said, already moving toward the door. "Miss Hale, forgive me. We will need to continue this conversation another time." "Of course," Charlotte said, rising as well. "Please, go to your sister. I hope she recovers quickly." He paused at the doorway, looking back at her with an expression that held both lingering suspicion and something softer, more vulnerable beneath it. "Thank you for understanding. Send word if there is anything I might do to help." He nodded once before disappearing through the doorway, leaving Charlotte alone in the drawing room, with only Barlow remaining, gathering the abandoned cards from the table with careful, practiced movements. His sister is prone to occasional fainting spells, Barlow explained quietly, noticing Charlotte's obvious concern. The physician believes it is nothing serious, though His Grace remains understandably protective of her. I hope she recovers swiftly. As do I, Miss Hale. Barlow studied her for a moment longer than necessary, something knowing in his expression that made Charlotte distinctly uncomfortable, before he simply nodded and gestured toward the door. I will arrange your carriage. The ride home passed in restless, anxious silence, Charlotte's mind racing through everything that had nearly been said, everything that remained dangerously unresolved between herself and Julian. She had been moments away from confessing everything, from finally releasing the exhausting burden of careful deception she had carried since their very first card game together. The interruption had spared her, at least temporarily, but she understood clearly that the conversation would resume eventually, and next time, there might be no fortunate interruption to save her from the consequences of full honesty. The following afternoon, Louisa arrived at Hollowmere unannounced, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity as she settled into the drawing room across from Charlotte. You look exhausted, she said bluntly. Tell me what happened at the Duke's townhouse. Charlotte recounted the evening carefully, describing the tense silence, the pointed questions, and finally the interrupted confession that had nearly spilled from her lips before the urgent news about the Duke's sister arrived. Louisa listened attentively, her expression growing more troubled with every detail. You nearly told him everything? I was moments away, Louisa. I do not know what stopped me exactly, beyond simple habit and years of careful practice at hiding the truth. But looking at his face, so genuinely troubled rather than simply accusing, I found myself wanting to be honest with him for the first time since all of this began. Perhaps that is not such a terrible thing, Louisa said gently. Perhaps honesty, however difficult, would serve you better than continuing this exhausting deception. Charlotte shook her head, though her conviction felt weaker than it had during their earlier conversation at the ball. You do not understand the full weight of what continuing this relationship honestly would require, Louisa. Even if he forgave the deception itself, there would still be Edmund's debts, still Hollowmere's uncertain future. Honesty does not pay creditors. No, Louisa agreed quietly, but neither does a broken heart, and I fear that is exactly what awaits you if this continues much longer without resolution. The words lingered uncomfortably between them, neither entirely able to dismiss the truth in Louisa's gentle warning. Charlotte changed the subject shortly afterward, unwilling to dwell further on complications she felt powerless to resolve immediately, though Louisa's concern followed her long after her friend departed for the evening. 2 days passed with no word from the Duke's household, and Charlotte's anxiety grew steadily with each passing hour. She sent a brief note inquiring after his sister's health, received only a polite, formal reply confirming the girl's recovery, nothing more personal or revealing beyond simple courtesy. The distance in his response troubled her more than open accusation would have. On the third day, while Charlotte sat in the study attempting to distract herself with household accounts, Edmund burst through the door, his face pale with fresh panic. Charlotte, we have a serious problem. Her stomach dropped immediately. What has happened? The remaining debt, the £600 I mentioned before. I made an error in my earlier calculations. It is not £600 remaining. It is closer to 900, and the creditors are demanding payment within the fortnight, or they intend to seize Hollowmere entirely. The news hit Charlotte like a physical blow, far worse than she had anticipated. £900, combined with what they had already spent simply surviving these past difficult months, represented an almost impossible sum to gather in such limited time, especially with her relationship with the Duke now hanging in such uncertain, fragile balance. How did this happen, Edmund? How did you miscalculate so significantly? Edmund's face flushed with shame. There were additional debts I had not fully disclosed, smaller sums borrowed from other sources that I hoped to settle quietly without troubling you further. I did not realize how quickly the interest would accumulate. Charlotte closed her eyes, fighting back the urge to lash out at her brother's carelessness, understanding that anger would accomplish nothing beyond further damaging their already strained relationship. How many other debts, Edmund? Tell me everything, right now, no more hidden surprises. He confessed everything then, every foolish wager, every desperate borrowing arrangement made in moments of panic over the preceding months. By the time he finished, Charlotte understood clearly that saving Hollowmere would require far more than she had originally planned, a sum significant enough that even her considerable skill at cards might struggle to provide it quickly enough. There was only one clear path forward. She would need to request one final, decisive game with the Duke, stakes high enough to settle the family's debts completely and permanently. regardless of whatever suspicion or distance had grown between them since their interrupted conversation. It was a terrible risk, approaching him again so soon after he had nearly confronted her directly about her deception. But Holomir's survival left her with no other viable option. That evening, Charlotte wrote a careful letter requesting one final game, framing it as an opportunity for the Duke to fully recover whatever losses he had suffered across their previous matches. She sealed the letter with trembling hands, uncertain whether she was offering him a genuine chance at redemption or simply walking directly into the confrontation she had been desperately avoiding. That night, sleep refused to come easily. Charlotte lay awake staring at the ceiling of her bedroom, listening to the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the old house around her, a house that had sheltered generations of her family and now stood on the very edge of being lost forever. She thought of her father, gone 3 years now, and wondered what he would say if he could see how far his daughter had traveled down this careful, dangerous path of deception, all in the name of protecting the home and family he had left behind. She thought, too, of Julian, of the warmth in his laughter during their first game, the genuine concern in his eyes when he spoke of his sister's illness, the honest vulnerability he had shown when admitting his suspicions rather than simply accusing her outright. He was not the cold, calculating nobleman she had expected when she first sat down across from him at Lord Grantham's card table. He was something far more complicated, someone capable of real warmth and real hurt, and she understood now, with painful clarity, that whatever happened during their final game together, she risked wounding him far more deeply than any amount of lost money ever could. But there was no other path available to her, not with £900 standing between her family and complete ruin. Whatever guilt she carried, whatever tenderness had grown unexpectedly between herself and the Duke, Holomir's survival had to remain her priority, even if it meant risking everything else in the process. Morning arrived gray and overcast, matching Charlotte's uncertain mood perfectly as she dressed and prepared to send her carefully worded letter requesting one final game. She read it over twice more before sealing it, searching for any hint of desperation that might reveal too much, satisfied finally that it struck the right careful balance between confidence and simple invitation. The response arrived faster than she expected, delivered by the same lean footman who had served at their previous games. The Duke had agreed, setting the game for 2 evenings hence, at his townhouse, stakes to be determined upon her arrival. There was no warmth in the brief formal note, nothing beyond simple confirmation of the arrangement, and Charlotte felt a fresh wave of uncertainty settle over her as she folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer alongside all the others. She spent the following day quietly preparing, reviewing every detail of her strategy with the same discipline Mr. Higgins had instilled in her years before, though her heart no longer felt fully committed to the careful calculation the plan required. Edmund watched her from across the breakfast table each morning, saying little, though the guilt in his eyes remained plain to see. Aunt Margaret offered no further warnings, seeming to understand that Charlotte had already heard them clearly enough, and that repeating them now would serve no purpose beyond adding to her niece's growing burden. By the time the appointed evening arrived, Charlotte felt strangely calm, the anxious uncertainty of the preceding days settling into a quiet, resolute determination. Whatever happened at the Duke's townhouse tonight, whatever truths finally emerged between them, she intended to face it directly, without flinching, the same way she had faced every difficult challenge since her father's passing 3 years before. Either way, there was no more time left for careful avoidance. The final hand was coming, whether she felt ready for it or not. The drawing room felt different tonight, stripped of its earlier warmth and replaced with something colder, more formal. A single card table stood at the center of the room, illuminated by tall candles that cast long shadows against the walls. Julian stood waiting near the fireplace as Charlotte entered, his expression unreadable, his posture stiff with a tension she had never seen in him before. "Miss Hale," he said, gesturing toward the table. "Thank you for coming. Your Grace." She took her seat, folding her hands carefully in her lap. "You mentioned the stakes would be determined this evening." "Everything," he said simply. "I intend to wager everything I am prepared to lose tonight, and I expect the same commitment from you." Charlotte's pulse quickened, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "That is a considerable sum, Your Grace. I am aware." He named the figure, and Charlotte felt her breath catch despite her best efforts at composure. It was more than enough to settle every remaining debt hanging over Holomere, more than enough to secure her family's future for years to come. It was also more money than she had ever wagered in her life, an amount that would utterly devastate her family if she lost. "I accept," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Julian studied her for a long moment before finally taking his seat across from her. Mr. Barlow stood near the door, the only witness present tonight. his expression carefully neutral though his eyes remained sharp and attentive. "Before we begin," Julian said quietly, "I want you to understand something, Miss Hale. This is not simply about the money for me anymore. I need to understand once and for all exactly who you are, and exactly what has been happening between us since the very first night we met." Charlotte met his gaze directly, feeling the full weight of everything unspoken pressing against her chest. "Then let us begin, Your Grace, and perhaps by the end, we will both have our answers." Before the first hand was dealt, Julian set down a small leather notebook beside his cards, its pages worn from frequent handling. Charlotte glanced at it curiously, and he noticed her attention immediately. "A record," he explained, his tone deliberately flat, "of every hand we have played together across our 3 previous games, the order of the cards, the amounts wagered, the moments you chose to press your advantage, and the moments you chose to hold back. I have studied it carefully these past 2 days." Charlotte felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her. She had not imagined he would go to such lengths, treating their card games not merely as social entertainment, but as a puzzle to be solved with the same discipline he likely applied to his estate's finances. It confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. Whatever else Julian Ashford was, he was not a man who accepted mystery easily, and he was certainly not a man who allowed himself to be outmaneuvered twice without eventually understanding exactly how it had happened. "And what did your notebook reveal, Your Grace?" "Patterns," he said simply. "Small ones, easy to miss individually, but unmistakable when studied together. You are remarkably consistent, Miss Hale, in ways that go beyond simple natural talent." She said nothing, unwilling to confirm or deny what he had clearly already concluded on his own. He studied her a moment longer, then closed the notebook and set it aside, gesturing for the first hand to be dealt. The cards were dealt, and the game began in earnest. Charlotte played with everything Mr. Higgins had ever taught her, every careful technique, every subtle observation, watching Julian's tell with practiced precision. But something had changed in him since their previous games. His finger no longer tapped the table edge quite so predictably. His expression remained guarded throughout, revealing far less than it once had. He had been studying her too, she realized with growing unease, watching her own habits, learning her patterns just as carefully as she had learned his. The early hands passed in tense silence, each testing the other's defenses without either gaining a clear advantage. Charlotte won the third hand decisively, and Julian's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though he said nothing, simply gathering the cards for the next deal. "You have grown quieter tonight," he observed finally, breaking the heavy silence between hands. "There seems little room for playful conversation, given the circumstances." "Perhaps you are right." They continued playing, the tension mounting steadily with each passing hand. Charlotte won 2 more, lost 1, and felt the weight of 900 pounds and her family's entire future pressing down upon every careful decision. She could not afford to lose tonight, not with so much depending on the outcome, and yet something in Julian's altered demeanor suggested he had prepared far more carefully for this final confrontation than she had anticipated. Midway through the game, during a brief pause while fresh candles were brought in to replace those burning low, Julian studied her with an intensity that made Charlotte distinctly uncomfortable. "I spoke with my sister," he said quietly, "after her illness passed, once she recovered fully. She has always possessed sharp instincts about people, sharper than my own, I confess. I described our card games to her, our conversations, everything that has passed between us since that first evening at Lord Grantham's." Charlotte's stomach tightened with dread. "And what did she conclude, Your Grace?" "She asked me a simple question. She asked whether I believed you had ever, even once, allowed genuine feeling to interfere with whatever careful strategy you had constructed around our meetings." His eyes held hers steadily. I did not have a confident answer for her. "Julian." The familiar use of his given name slipped out before Charlotte could stop herself, and she watched his expression shift subtly at the sound of it. "Tell me honestly," he said, his voice softer now, though no less serious. "Has any part of this been real, or have I simply been another mark, another wealthy fool for you to deceive alongside your carefully practiced skills at cards?" The question hung between them, demanding an answer Charlotte could no longer avoid, or deflect with careful half-truths. She thought of her father's cards resting in the study drawer at home, of Mr. Higgins's patient instruction, of every calculated decision that had led her to this exact moment. But she also thought of Julian's genuine laughter during their first game, his gentle concern for his sister, the honest vulnerability he had shown throughout their entire complicated acquaintance. "It has been real," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts at composure. Whatever else I have concealed from you, Your Grace, my feelings have never been part of any calculated strategy. Something shifted in his expression, relief mixed uncomfortably with lingering suspicion. Then why continue deceiving me about the cards themselves? If your feelings were genuine, why not simply tell me the truth from the beginning? Because the truth would have cost me everything, Charlotte said, the words spilling out now with a desperate honesty she could no longer contain. My family's estate stands on the very edge of ruin, Your Grace. My brother's debts, mounting faster than I could manage them honestly, threatened to destroy everything my father worked his entire life to build. I needed money, quickly and reliably, and cards were the only skill I possessed capable of providing it. So you deceived me deliberately? Yes, she admitted, unable to deny it any longer. I used everything Mr. Higgins ever taught me, every advantage I could gain, because I believed, genuinely believed, that I had no other choice available to me. Julian remained silent for a long moment, processing her confession with an expression Charlotte could not fully read. Barlow, still standing near the door, shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the weight of the moment unfolding before him. How much have you won from me altogether? Julian asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. Charlotte calculated quickly. Nearly 900 pounds, across our 3 previous games. And tonight, you intended to win considerably more. Yes. Enough to settle your family's remaining debts entirely. Yes, she repeated, feeling each admission strip away another layer of the careful protection she had maintained since their very first meeting. Barlow shifted near the door, and for a moment Charlotte thought he might excuse himself entirely, granting them the privacy such a conversation clearly demanded. Instead, he remained fixed in place, his loyalty to his employer apparently outweighing any instinct toward discretion. Charlotte hardly noticed him at all, her attention entirely consumed by the man seated across from her, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight, his expression a battlefield of conflicting emotions he no longer seemed able to fully hide. Julian rose from the table abruptly, walking toward the fireplace, his back turned toward her as he stared into the flickering flames. Charlotte watched him carefully, uncertain whether his silence signaled anger, disappointment, or something else entirely that she could not yet name. I confess, he said finally, still facing the fire, part of me suspected something very close to this truth for weeks now. The anonymous letter, my own careful observations, even Barlow's quiet investigations, all pointed toward exactly this conclusion. And yet, hearing you admit it directly still wounds far more deeply than I expected. Julian, Please, he said, turning back to face her, his expression tightly controlled. Let me finish. Charlotte fell silent, watching him carefully, bracing herself for whatever judgment he intended to deliver. I do not fault you entirely for wanting to save your family, he continued. I understand desperation drives people toward choices they might otherwise never consider. What wounds me, Charlotte, is not simply the deception itself, but the fact that you continued it even after realizing, as you claim, that your feelings toward me had become genuine. You had countless opportunities to tell me the truth, and instead you chose silence, again and again, allowing me to continue believing something false about both my losses and your affections. I was afraid, she admitted quietly. Afraid that honesty would cost me not just the money my family desperately needed, but also whatever genuine connection had grown between us. And instead, your continued silence has cost us both exactly that. The finality in his voice struck Charlotte like a physical blow. She had known, somewhere beneath her careful calculations, that this moment might arrive eventually, that her deception could not continue indefinitely without consequence. But hearing the consequence stated so plainly, so definitively, proved far more devastating than she had anticipated. What happens now? She asked quietly, uncertain whether she truly wanted to hear the answer. Julian returned to the table slowly, gathering the abandoned cards with careful, deliberate movements. We finished the game, as agreed. Whatever the outcome, I intend to honor our wager fully. But I cannot promise anything beyond that, Charlotte. Not tonight. They resumed playing in heavy, painful silence, the earlier tension now replaced with something far more sorrowful. Charlotte found her concentration wavering, her carefully honed skills faltering beneath the weight of Julian's wounded, controlled expression across the table. She won several hands regardless, her instincts carrying her through even as her heart felt increasingly heavy with regret. As the game approached its final hand, the outcome nearly decided, Charlotte found herself facing an impossible choice. She held cards strong enough to secure a decisive victory, enough to settle her family's debts completely and permanently. But looking at Julian's carefully guarded expression across the table, understanding fully the pain her prolonged deception had caused him, she hesitated. Julian, she said quietly, setting her cards face down on the table before the final decisive play. I cannot finish this game the way I originally intended. He looked up, surprised by the sudden shift in her demeanor. What do you mean? I mean that whatever remains of tonight's wager, I no longer wish to win it through deception. If you wish to end the game now, declaring yourself the victor by default, I will accept that outcome without complaint. I have caused you enough dishonesty already. I refuse to add anything further to that burden. Julian studied her for a long, silent moment, something shifting behind his guarded expression, though Charlotte could not yet determine exactly what it meant. Barlow, still watching from near the door, remained carefully still, sensing the significance of the moment unfolding before him. That is a remarkable offer, Julian said finally, coming from someone who claims she needed this money desperately enough to justify months of careful deception. Perhaps, Charlotte admitted, I have finally realized that some things matter more than money, Your Grace, even when losing them threatens everything else I hold dear. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibility, as Julian considered her words carefully, weighing everything that had unfolded across their tense, complicated evening together. You surprise me, Charlotte, he said finally, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its earlier formality. Everything I believed about you these past weeks suggested a woman entirely focused on securing her family's fortune by any means necessary. And yet here you sit, willingly surrendering the very victory you have spent months carefully engineering. Perhaps I am not entirely the woman you believed me to be, she said softly. Or perhaps I have simply grown tired of choosing calculation over honesty, regardless of what it costs me. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching her face as though trying to reconcile the composed, calculating card player he had first met with the vulnerable woman now sitting before him, having just surrendered every advantage she had worked so carefully to build. Barlow cleared his throat quietly near the door, a small reminder that they were not entirely alone, though neither Julian nor Charlotte seemed particularly concerned with his presence any longer. I need time to consider everything you have told me tonight, Julian said finally, gathering the remaining cards with slow, deliberate movements. The deception, the reasons behind it, and everything you have just offered to surrender rather than continue it further. This has not been a simple evening for either of us. I understand, Your Grace. Julian, he corrected quietly. After everything tonight, I think we are well beyond such formality between us. The small correction, offered so gently despite everything else weighing between them, brought unexpected tears to Charlotte's eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let her composure fully crumble in front of him now, after everything else she had already surrendered this evening. Julian, she repeated softly, testing the familiarity of his name once more. He nodded once, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before rising from the table and gesturing toward the door. It grows late. Allow me to see you to your carriage. They walked together in silence through the quiet corridors of his townhouse, neither speaking, both lost in the heavy weight of everything that had passed between them tonight. At the entrance, as her carriage waited in the cool evening darkness, Julian paused, studying her face carefully one final time. Whatever I decide, he said quietly, please understand that tonight changed something between us, Charlotte. I do not yet know exactly what, but I know it cannot simply return to how things were before. I understand, she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. Whatever you decide, Julian, I am grateful you allowed me the chance to finally be honest with you, however incomplete and however late that honesty arrived. He helped her into the carriage, his hand lingering against hers a moment longer than strictly necessary, before stepping back and allowing the door to close between them. As the carriage pulled away into the darkened streets, Charlotte watched his figure grow smaller through the small window, uncertain whether she had just witnessed the beginning of something new between them, or the quiet, sorrowful ending of everything she had allowed herself to hope for. Either way, the game, in every sense that mattered, was finally over. What remained now was simply waiting to discover what Julian Ashford would decide to do with the fragile, complicated truth she had finally given him. 3 days passed without a single word from Julian, and with each passing hour, Charlotte's hope dimmed a little further. She had expected silence might follow their tense confrontation, but the complete absence of any communication, not even a formal note acknowledging their unfinished wager, left her increasingly convinced that she had lost him entirely. Edmund noticed her withdrawn mood immediately, though he wisely chose not to press her for details beyond simple concern. You have hardly eaten anything in days, Charlotte. Whatever happened between you and the Duke, it seems to have taken a considerable toll. I told him the truth, she said quietly, staring out the drawing room window at the neglected gardens beyond. Everything, Edmund. About Mr. Higgins, about the cards, about how I have been winning against him these past weeks. Edmund's eyes widened with shock. Everything? Charlotte, what were you thinking? Our family's entire future depended on. I know exactly what it depended on, she interrupted, her voice sharper than intended. But I could not continue deceiving him any longer, not once I understood how deeply my feelings for him had grown. Continuing the lie felt like a betrayal I was no longer willing to commit, regardless of the consequences. Her brother studied her for a long moment, his earlier frustration softening into something closer to understanding. And now? Now we wait, she said simply, and hope that Holomir's fate does not depend entirely on whatever the Duke decides to do with what I have told him. Aunt Margaret, who had been listening quietly from her chair near the fireplace, finally spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. You did the right thing, Charlotte, regardless of the outcome. Whatever money you might have won through continued deception would have come at a cost far greater than any sum could repay. A clear conscience is worth more than any fortune, even one large enough to save this house. Charlotte appreciated her aunt's words, though they did little to ease the anxious uncertainty gripping her chest as each day passed without word from Julian. The remaining creditor's deadline loomed ever closer, and without the Duke's winnings, or some other unexpected source of funds, Holomir's future remained genuinely uncertain. On the fourth day, as Charlotte sat once again reviewing the household's dwindling finances in her father's old study, a servant announced an unexpected visitor. She looked up, startled, to find Julian himself standing in the doorway, dressed simply, without the formal elegance of their previous meetings, his expression difficult to read. Your Grace, she said, rising quickly from her chair. I did not expect you. Julian, he corrected gently, stepping into the room. I hope you do not mind the intrusion. I found I could no longer wait for a more formal arrangement before speaking with you again. Of course not. Please, sit. He remained standing instead, glancing briefly around the modest study, taking in the worn furniture, the stack of unpaid bills visible on the desk, the general atmosphere of a household fighting quietly against financial collapse. Charlotte felt a flush of embarrassment at having him witness such clear evidence of her family's struggles, though she said nothing, waiting instead for him to speak first. I have spent these past 3 days thinking carefully about everything you told me, he said finally. The deception, certainly, but more importantly the reasons behind it, and the choice you made to finally abandon it, rather than continue winning through dishonest means. I understand if you cannot forgive the deception itself, Charlotte said quietly. I deceived you deliberately, for weeks, allowing you to believe something false about both my skills and my intentions. That is not something easily forgiven, regardless of the circumstances that drove me toward it. No, he agreed, it is not easily forgiven. And I will admit these past 3 days have been difficult ones, filled with considerable anger and wounded pride as I processed everything you confessed. Charlotte's heart sank further with every word, bracing herself for the rejection she had increasingly come to expect. But, Julian continued, his expression softening slightly, I have also spent considerable time thinking about everything else that passed between us these past weeks. Your genuine laughter during our first game, entirely unconnected to any calculated strategy. Your obvious concern when my sister fell ill, the remarkable choice you made, just 3 nights ago, to surrender a victory that would have solved your family's every financial difficulty, simply because you could no longer bear to win it through continued dishonesty. He paused, studying her carefully. That choice, Charlotte, told me something important about your character, something that ultimately mattered far more than the initial deception itself. Hope flickered cautiously in Charlotte's chest, though she remained afraid to fully embrace it. What are you saying, Julian? I am saying that I understand why you did what you did. Desperation drives people toward difficult choices, and I cannot fault you entirely for wanting to protect your family by whatever means seemed available to you. What matters more to me now is not the deception itself, but everything that came after it. Your honesty, however delayed, your willingness to sacrifice victory rather than continue building our relationship on dishonest foundations. Julian, I never meant to hurt you. Please believe that, whatever else you think of my earlier choices. I believe you, he said simply. And that belief is precisely why I am here today, rather than simply sending a formal note ending our acquaintance entirely. He crossed the room slowly, stopping just before her, close enough that Charlotte could see the genuine warmth returning to his expression, replacing the guarded distance that had characterized their final card game together. I spoke with my sister again yesterday, he continued. She reminded me that everyone carries secrets, Everyone makes difficult choices under difficult circumstances, and that judging someone entirely by their worst moment, rather than considering their character as a whole, is rarely fair or wise. She encouraged me to consider not simply what you did, Charlotte, but who you have shown yourself to be beneath the deception. And what conclusion did you reach? That I care for you, he said, his voice steady and certain despite the vulnerability clearly evident in his expression. More deeply than I initially wanted to admit, even to myself. And that whatever difficulties brought us to this point, I am not prepared to simply walk away from what has grown between us these past weeks. Charlotte felt tears gathering in her eyes, relief and disbelief mingling together as she absorbed his words. Julian, I do not know what to say. Say that you will allow me to help settle your family's remaining debts, he said. Not as payment for anything won or lost across our card games, but simply as someone who cares about your well-being, and about securing Hollowmere's future alongside you, if you will permit it. I cannot accept such generosity without offering something in return. Then marry me, he said simply, the words hanging unexpectedly in the quiet study between them, not out of obligation or desperate necessity, but because I have come to believe, quite firmly, that whatever complicated path brought us together, we belong together now. Your honesty these past few days, however painful it was to hear, showed me a woman of genuine character and courage. I would be honored if you agreed to become my wife. Charlotte stared at him, stunned by the sudden, unexpected proposal, her mind racing through everything that had led them to this exact moment. The desperate first card game, driven entirely by financial necessity, the growing warmth and connection that had complicated her original careful plan, the painful confession 3 nights ago, and the agonizing uncertainty of the days that followed. Are you certain, Julian? After everything I have done, after the deception and the lies, however well-intentioned, I have never been more certain of anything, he said, taking her hands gently in his own. You risked everything to finally be honest with me, Charlotte. Even when honesty threatened to cost you your family's entire future. That kind of courage is rare, and it is exactly the kind of character I want in a wife, in a partner, for whatever challenges life brings us next. Charlotte felt the last of her careful composure finally crumble entirely, tears spilling freely now as she absorbed the full weight of his proposal, the relief, the joy, the disbelief that everything she had feared losing forever might instead be transformed into something far more wonderful than she had ever dared hope for. Yes, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Julian, I will marry you. He drew her gently into his arms, and for the first time since their very first card game together, Charlotte allowed herself to fully release every careful calculation, every guarded strategy, embracing instead the genuine, uncomplicated joy of the moment. Before he departed that afternoon, Julian insisted on speaking briefly with Edmund, wanting to address the family's financial troubles directly and honestly, rather than leaving such matters unspoken between them. Edmund, initially embarrassed by the prospect of discussing his mistakes with the man his sister intended to marry, found Julian surprisingly understanding. I made considerable mistakes myself in my younger years, Julian admitted, as the two men sat together in the study. Wagers I should never have made, debts that took considerable time and difficulty to fully resolve. I do not judge you harshly for similar struggles, Edmund, particularly given the pressures you faced trying to manage your family's affairs so young. I appreciate your understanding, Your Grace, though I confess I hardly feel I deserve it, given everything my carelessness nearly cost my sister. Your sister's courage and skill saved this family long before I ever became involved, Julian said firmly. Whatever mistakes led to that necessity, the outcome ultimately brought considerable good, however unconventional the path. I would simply ask that going forward, you allow both Charlotte and myself to help you manage future difficulties more directly, rather than facing them alone. Edmund nodded, visibly relieved by Julian's generous, practical approach to a situation that could easily have become far more humiliating. Thank you, Julian. I will not squander this second chance. See that you do not, Julian said, though his tone remained warm rather than harsh. Your sister has sacrificed a great deal for this family's sake. It would be a poor repayment indeed to continue burdening her with further difficulties she should not have to bear alone. The conversation marked a turning point for Edmund as well, who took Julian's words seriously, applying himself with renewed diligence to managing Hollowmere's remaining affairs responsibly, determined never again to place his family in such a precarious position. News of their engagement spread quickly through society, accompanied by considerable speculation about the unusual courtship that had preceded it. Some whispered about the rumors of Charlotte's remarkable skill at cards, though few dared voice such suspicions directly to the Duke himself, unwilling to risk his displeasure over questioning his chosen bride. Louisa, delighted by her friend's remarkable turn of fortune, could not resist teasing Charlotte gently about the whole affair during one of their final visits before the wedding. "You must admit, it is a rather extraordinary story. The clever lady who nearly ruined the Duke at cards, only to win his heart entirely by finally telling him the truth. When you put it that way," Charlotte said, laughing despite herself, "it sounds almost like something from a novel. Perhaps someday someone will write it down," Louisa said with a playful grin. "Though I doubt anyone would believe such an unlikely ending. A lady saved from ruin not by her skill at deception, but by finally abandoning it entirely. I would not have believed it myself, a few short weeks ago," Charlotte admitted. "I fully expected honesty to cost me everything, rather than ultimately bringing me more happiness than I ever thought possible. Sometimes," Louisa said, growing more serious, "the greatest risks bring the greatest rewards, Charlotte. I am simply glad you found the courage to take that particular risk, when it mattered most." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the dressmaker, come to finalize the last adjustments to Charlotte's wedding gown, and the two friends spent the remainder of the afternoon in cheerful preparation, the earlier tension and uncertainty of recent weeks finally giving way entirely to genuine excitement and anticipation. Edmund's debts were settled swiftly and completely, not through any further card games, but through Julian's generous, genuine assistance, offered freely as part of joining their two families together. Holomir's future, once so desperately uncertain, became secure almost overnight, though Charlotte understood clearly that the true victory lay not simply in the financial security itself, but in the honest, genuine relationship she had ultimately built with Julian, built finally on truth rather than careful deception. Louisa, thrilled by the unexpected happy resolution to her friend's complicated courtship, insisted on helping plan an elaborate wedding celebration, though Charlotte and Julian ultimately chose something smaller and more intimate, held quietly at Holomere itself, surrounded only by close family and trusted friends. On the morning of their wedding, as Charlotte prepared herself in her childhood bedroom, Aunt Margaret helped arrange her hair, smiling warmly at her niece's reflection in the mirror. "You have come such a long way, Charlotte, from that desperate young woman who sat down at Lord Grantham's card table all those weeks ago." "I could not have imagined this outcome," Charlotte admitted, studying her own reflection thoughtfully. "I expected, at best, to win enough money to save Holomere temporarily. I never imagined I might find genuine happiness alongside financial security." "Sometimes," her aunt said gently, "the greatest victories arrive precisely when we finally stop calculating every advantage, and simply allow ourselves to be honest about what truly matters." Later that afternoon, standing before their small, intimate gathering of family and friends, Charlotte looked into Julian's warm, steady eyes as they exchanged their vows, feeling nothing but genuine joy and gratitude for the unexpected path that had brought them together. Whatever calculated deception had marked their beginning, their future together, she understood clearly now, would be built entirely on honesty, trust, and the genuine affection that had ultimately proven far more valuable than any sum of money won or lost across a card table. As the small wedding celebration continued into the evening, Julian pulled Charlotte aside for a quiet moment, away from the cheerful noise of their gathered guests. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, familiar object, the worn deck of cards Mr. Higgins had given her years before, which she had left behind at his townhouse during their final tense card game together. "I believe these belong to you," he said, pressing them gently into her hands. Charlotte laughed softly, turning the familiar cards over in her fingers. "I suppose our card-playing days are finally behind us, Your Grace." "Perhaps not entirely," he said, a playful smile finally returning fully to his expression. "I rather enjoyed our games together, deception aside. Perhaps, now and then, we might still enjoy a friendly match, purely for entertainment, with nothing more serious than pride at stake." "I would like that very much," Charlotte said, smiling warmly as she slipped the cards into her pocket, a reminder now, not of desperate necessity, but of the remarkable, unexpected journey that had brought her finally to genuine happiness, honestly earned at last. Together, they returned to their gathered guests, ready to begin their new life together, built finally on truth rather than careful calculation, and richer for it than any amount of winnings ever could have made them. Later that night, once the guests had departed and Holomere finally settled into quiet stillness, Charlotte stood once more at her bedroom window, looking out over the gardens that had witnessed so much worry and uncertainty over the preceding months. The moonlight fell softly across the grounds, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, She felt no anxious calculations running through her mind, no careful strategies weighing against desperate necessity. There was only quiet contentment, and the steady, comforting knowledge that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would face them honestly, and she would not face them alone. Julian found her there a short while later, having excused himself briefly from the last of their lingering guests. He came to stand beside her at the window, saying nothing at first, simply sharing the comfortable silence between them. "Regrets?" he asked finally, glancing at her with a small, knowing smile. "None," Charlotte said honestly. "Only gratitude for a chance I never expected to receive, and for a man wise enough to see past my mistakes toward whatever good remained underneath them." "I saw far more than good, Charlotte," he said softly. "I saw courage, and cleverness, and a willingness to fight fiercely for the people you love. Those are not small qualities. They are precisely why I fell in love with you, deception and all." She turned to him, resting her head gently against his shoulder as they continued looking out over the moonlit gardens together. Whatever uncertain, complicated path had brought them to this exact moment, Charlotte understood clearly now that it had led them somewhere worth arriving. A partnership built finally on honesty, trust, and a genuine affection strong enough to outlast even the most difficult beginnings. The cards that had once represented desperate necessity now rested quietly in her dressing table drawer, a keepsake rather than a tool, a reminder of everything she had risked and everything she had ultimately gained by finally choosing truth over careful calculation. And as she stood there in the quiet moonlight beside her husband, Charlotte finally allowed herself to simply enjoy the moment, without strategy, without hidden agenda, content at last in the knowledge that some victories could never be measured in coins won across a card table. A year after their wedding, a letter arrived at the townhouse that would test everything Charlotte and Julian had built together since that final, honest card game had changed the course of their lives. The letter came from a man named Mr. Colton Reese, a distant acquaintance of Julian's from his university years, now fallen on considerably harder times. He wrote requesting an urgent meeting, hinting darkly at information regarding Charlotte's past that he claimed could prove damaging if it ever became widely known throughout society. He did not state his demands outright, but the implication was clear enough: silence, in exchange for a substantial sum of money. Julian read the letter twice, his expression darkening with each pass, before setting it down carefully on his desk and calling for Charlotte to join him in the study. "What is it?" she asked, noticing immediately the tension in his posture. He handed her the letter without a word, watching her expression carefully as she read through its careful, veiled threats. Her face paled slightly, though she remained otherwise composed. "He knows about Mr. Higgins," she said quietly, "about the card counting, the deliberate deception during our courtship. If this becomes public knowledge, Julian, it could damage your reputation considerably, particularly given your standing in society." "I am far more concerned about the damage it might cause you," Julian said firmly. "This is clearly an attempt at extortion, nothing more. The question is how we intend to handle it." Charlotte considered the matter carefully, old instincts stirring beneath her current composure. Instincts sharpened years before by Mr. Higgins's patient instruction. "We could pay him, I suppose, though there is no guarantee he would not simply return later, demanding more." "That thought occurred to me as well," Julian said. "Blackmailers rarely stop after a single payment." "Then, perhaps," Charlotte said slowly, an idea beginning to form, "we should consider a different approach entirely." Aunt Margaret, who had come to stay with them for a short visit, listened carefully as Julian and Charlotte discussed their plan late into the evening. "You are certain confronting him directly is wiser than simply ignoring the letter entirely?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "Ignoring it risks allowing him to act on his threats without warning," Julian explained. "Better to address the matter directly, on our own terms, while we still hold the advantage of surprise." "And you are certain, Charlotte, that you wish to be present for such a confrontation? It cannot be pleasant, facing a man attempting to extort you over your own past." Charlotte considered the question seriously before answering. "I spent months hiding from the truth of my own actions, Aunt Margaret, allowing fear to dictate my choices instead of courage. I do not intend to make that same mistake again. If Mr. Reese believes he holds power over us through secrecy, the surest way to strip that power away is to face him openly, without flinching." Her aunt studied her for a long moment, pride evident in her expression despite her lingering worry. "You have grown considerably since that first desperate evening at Lord Grantham's card table." "I have had excellent teachers," Charlotte said, glancing warmly toward Julian. The following morning, Julian sent a carefully worded reply to Mr. Reese, agreeing to a private meeting without revealing how thoroughly prepared they intended to be for the confrontation. Charlotte spent the intervening time reviewing everything she remembered about the few acquaintances who might have known enough about Mr. Higgins to share such information, though she suspected, ultimately, that the details mattered less than their unified response once the meeting itself began. 2 days later, Julian arranged a private meeting with Mr. Reese at a quiet inn on the outskirts of London, agreeing ostensibly to discuss the matter of payment. Charlotte insisted on accompanying him, dressed modestly, and seated quietly in the corner of the private room they had reserved. Introduced simply as Julian's companion rather than his wife, her identity deliberately obscured for the moment. Mr. Reese arrived precisely on time, a thin, nervous man whose confident letter had not adequately prepared Julian for his considerably less impressive presence in person. He seated himself across from Julian, glancing briefly and dismissively at the quiet woman in the corner, before turning his full attention toward the matter at hand. "I trust you have considered my proposal carefully, Your Grace," he began, attempting an air of confidence that did not entirely mask his obvious nervousness. "I have," Julian said evenly, "though I confess I find myself curious about something first. How exactly did you come to learn about Mr. Higgins and his former occupation?" Reese hesitated slightly before answering. "I have my sources, Your Grace. Sources who remember Higgins from his earlier years, before he found more respectable employment as a tutor." "I see." Julian glanced briefly toward Charlotte, a small, deliberate signal they had agreed upon beforehand. "Perhaps we might discuss the specific evidence you claim to possess. Letters, perhaps? Witnesses willing to testify formally to these claims?" Reese shifted uncomfortably. "I possess sufficient evidence to cause considerable difficulty for your household, should this matter become public." "That is not quite an answer to my question," Julian pressed gently. Charlotte rose quietly from her corner seat, stepping forward into the candlelight, watching Reese's expression shift from confusion to sudden, dawning recognition as he finally registered her identity fully. "Perhaps I might answer more directly," she said calmly. "Mr. Higgins did indeed teach me certain skills at cards, skills I used, admittedly, during my early acquaintance with my husband. This is not a secret I have hidden from him. He has known the full truth for over a year now, long before we married." Reese's confident posture crumbled visibly. "That cannot be, if he already knew. Then your letter contains nothing capable of damaging either my reputation or my husband's," Charlotte finished calmly. "We are already fully aware of everything you believed yourself capable of exposing, Mr. Reese. Our marriage was built, quite deliberately, on complete honesty regarding my past, precisely to prevent men like yourself from finding any leverage against us." For a long, tense moment, Reese said nothing, clearly scrambling to salvage some remaining advantage from a plan that had crumbled entirely before it truly began. "I could still speak to others," he said finally, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Spread the story throughout society regardless of your own awareness of it." "You could," Julian agreed calmly, "though I doubt it would accomplish much beyond damaging your own already precarious reputation. Society tends to look rather unfavorably upon men who attempt to extort money from respected households through empty threats. I imagine such a story, once it became known, would close considerably more doors for you than it would for us." Reese's face paled further as the full weight of his failed scheme settled over him. Without the element of surprise, without genuine leverage over information Julian and Charlotte had already addressed honestly between themselves, his threats amounted to nothing more than empty, desperate posturing. "I believe this meeting has concluded," Julian said, rising from his seat. "I would strongly advise against attempting similar schemes in the future, Mr. Reese, particularly against households prepared as thoroughly as ours." Reese left the inn quickly afterward, his earlier confidence entirely deflated, and Charlotte and Julian returned to their carriage together, relief settling comfortably between them after the tense confrontation. "That went considerably better than I expected," Charlotte admitted, once they were safely underway. "I never doubted it would," Julian said, taking her hand gently in his own. "Honesty, once fully established between us, left him with absolutely nothing capable of threatening our happiness." "It seems Mr. Higgins's lessons proved useful once more," Charlotte said with a small, satisfied smile. Though this time, reading a person's weaknesses across the table required no cards at all. Julian laughed warmly, the tension of the confrontation finally easing entirely from his shoulders. "I suspect you would have managed just as effectively without my assistance." "Perhaps," Charlotte said, "though I find I much prefer facing such challenges together, rather than navigating them entirely alone, as I once believed necessary." The carriage continued through the darkened streets toward home, and Charlotte found herself reflecting quietly on how far she had traveled since that first desperate evening at Lord Grantham's card table. She had begun her acquaintance with Julian through calculated deception, driven by fear and desperate necessity, uncertain whether honesty could ever truly coexist with survival. Tonight, that same honesty, fully embraced and openly shared between them, had proven far more powerful than any careful deception ever could have managed alone. When they arrived home, Edmund met them in the entrance hall, having waited anxiously for news of the confrontation. "Well, what happened?" "Nothing came of it," Charlotte said, relief evident in her voice as she recounted the evening's events. "Mr. Reese's scheme collapsed entirely once he realized we had nothing left to hide." Edmund exhaled deeply, visible relief washing over his features. "I confess I worried considerably while you were gone. I am glad it resolved so cleanly." "As am I," Charlotte said, embracing her brother warmly, before making her way upstairs, exhausted but deeply content after the evening's unexpected challenge. That night, as she prepared for bed, Julian joined her by the window, the same window where they had stood together on their wedding night, looking out over Hollowmere's peaceful gardens. "I find myself grateful, once again, for your honesty tonight," he said quietly. "A year ago, you might have handled such a threat very differently, relying solely on calculation and careful deception rather than simple, direct truth." "A year ago," Charlotte agreed, "I did not yet understand how much stronger honesty could be than any careful strategy I might construct instead." "And now?" "Now," she said, leaning contentedly against him, "I understand it completely. Whatever challenges we face going forward, Julian, I intend to meet them honestly, alongside you, rather than alone and calculating as I once believed necessary." He pressed a gentle kiss against her forehead, and together they remained by the window a while longer, watching the moonlight settle peacefully over the grounds below, secure at last in a partnership built not on deception or desperate necessity, but on genuine trust, hard-won and deeply treasured, strong enough now to withstand whatever future challenges might eventually arise. In the weeks that followed, word of the failed extortion attempt never spread beyond their small circle, exactly as Julian had predicted. Mr. Reese, having lost his only leverage, quietly disappeared from London society altogether, presumably seeking easier targets elsewhere. Charlotte thought of him only rarely afterward, and always with a small measure of quiet satisfaction rather than lingering fear. Hollowmere continued to flourish under Edmund's more careful management, supported generously by Julian's guidance whenever difficult decisions arose. The estate that had once stood on the very edge of ruin slowly transformed into a thriving, comfortable home once more, its gardens restored, its accounts finally balanced, its future secure for the first time in years. Charlotte often thought back to that first desperate evening at Lord Grantham's card table, marveling quietly at how far she had traveled since then. She had begun her acquaintance with Julian through careful calculation, convinced that survival required constant strategy and hidden agendas. She understood now, with the clarity that only time and genuine happiness could provide, that the greatest victory of her life had come not from any hand of cards she had ever played, but from the moment she finally chose honesty over deception, trusting that the truth, however frightening to reveal, could ultimately build something far stronger than any careful lie ever could. Years later, when their own children grew old enough to ask about how their parents had first met, Charlotte and Julian would share the story together, laughing warmly over the memory of that first tense card game, the anonymous letter, the painful confession, and the honest, courageous choice that had ultimately brought them together. It became, in time, not a secret to be hidden away, but a cherished story of resilience, courage, and the quiet, powerful strength found in choosing truth over fear, regardless of the cost it demanded in the moment. And every so often, on quiet evenings when the household had settled and the candles burned low, Julian would produce the same worn deck of cards Mr. Higgins had once given Charlotte, and the two of them would play a friendly hand together, not for money, not for advantage, but simply for the shared pleasure of each other's company, secure always in the knowledge that whatever the outcome of any single game, the greater victory of their life together had already been won, honestly and completely, long before the final card was ever dealt.